Once again, thank you for having me here, and thanks for introducing me in the talk. And so I have some overarching goals that I want to kind of hit with this talk today. And so you all may or may not be familiar with the Transgressed book, but I want to pull everybody in who may or may not have read the book, hit some of those highlights. But Transgressed has been out for about 3 years now, so I've got a lot of new research findings on transgender lives, especially with this intimate partner violence question, which I'll refer to as IPV for short, that I'm going to use to kind of thread through a narrative that updates some of the findings from Transgressed, or just gives it kind of broader context since the sample in Transgressed was so small. So I can share some of these publications later, either through email or I'll figure out the chat to see if I can drop these. But I just want to highlight that Transgressed is the focus of the talk, but I'm pulling in recent findings from the US Transgender Survey, which is the most representative and largest transgender sample of people living in the US, including US territories like Puerto Rico, where I'm from. It's exciting data where US territories like Puerto Rico are not often included. And so I want to kind of tie in some of these more recent findings as well. So as we move forward, there's going to be a lot of specialized language. Many of us here are studying gender topics, so we're already experts. Some of us are learning different things, and some of us are at different stages, perhaps, of engaging with some of these topics. I'm going to use the word trans for short for transgender, and I'm using that as a really broad umbrella term to capture all genders that exist outside of the binary of man and woman. I'll talk about or refer to cisgender people. Those are people whose sex assigned at birth lines up with their gender identity. And then I'll use language like genderism, which is more commonly these days referred to as cisnormative or cisnormativity, to refer to a social and cultural system that acknowledges two and only two genders. And of course, I'm going to also share a couple of brief quotes from some of my participants. So there will be some violence, some harsh language, of course, transphobia, and other issues throughout. So where are we with what do we know about transgender IPV in the US? I'm already kind of following here what we have from the USTS, the US Transgender Survey, which was conducted in 2015. It's got over 20,000 transgender respondents. As I mentioned earlier, while it's not a probability-based sample, it's probably the largest US transgender survey in the country so far. And it's got some interesting metrics for IPV. And one of the descriptive findings that we found here is that more than half of transgender respondents or transgender people in the US might be experiencing some form of intimate partner violence. And this is spread throughout different types of IPV, like physical, and IPV, sexual, controlling aspects of IPV that I'll hit a little bit later in the talk. But overall, while we don't have great, easily apples to apples kind of comparative samples between cisgender people and transgender people, broadly, the research is showing that trans people might be at a uniquely higher risk for intimate partner violence, even when compared to, say, cisgender women who also experience a pretty significant level of risk for IPV. So I want to kind of paint this broad picture that I attempt to do in Transgressed in a lot of my research as well, which is that if we're going to talk about intimate partner violence in transgender lives, we really kind of have to situate IPV within the broader context of the intersections of violence. And what I'm saying here is that this isn't one form of IP or violence that transgender people are experiencing, but rather that there's kind of myriad violences that are occurring and intersect and fuel off of each other. And so while IPV is an interpersonal form of violence, I think it's important to understand how violence exists institutionally. think through the police state, the carceral state, education system, public accommodations, and then broadly how violence is structured in the way we organize and order society, like economic marginalization, experiences with homelessness, for example. And so why I think it's important to theoretically couch IPV within the intersections of violence is that we see that it tells us something about vulnerability for violence or heightened risk for violence that transgender people experience. Even more importantly is that when we think intersectionally, we know we don't live single issue lives. We're not just one thing. We don't have one identity, and our histories are not linear. And when we think about and complicate our identities and the systems of oppression around these identities, we see that there's a broad trans antagonistic culture, meaning a culture that's hostile towards transgender people, which makes them more likely to experience institutional and structural forms of violence that we know are correlated to heightened vulnerability for intimate partner violence. This is especially true for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color living in the US. For example, you'll see from a few years ago, Tracy Williams here, a Houston Black transgender woman who was murdered by her longtime boyfriend at the time, capturing, of course, some national attention there, really speaks to what some of the research is finding, that transgender homicides usually get covered as if they are a hate crime, when the research is kind of showing us that a lot, maybe half or more of transgender homicides are actually perpetrated by a former or current romantic or intimate partner, as was the case for Tracy. I'm citing Dino 2017 here, who did a study in the American Journal of Public Health looking at trans homicides, and in particular found that trans people were actually in that large representative sample not at higher risk for violence when compared to cisgender people until the researchers put in the race and ethnicity variables, which showed heightened risk for Black and Latina transgender people living in the US. So as we're kind of thinking intersectionally, I'm focusing on giving this a little bit more characterization, interpersonal violence, for example, from the USTS. And what you'll see on your screen is 3 of the main types of violence that these researchers asked, and just a basic descriptive frequency of victimization rates by race and ethnicity among non-white groups, specifically because these rates were higher than white groups. So it was interesting to look at the differences between these marginalized groups. You'll notice here that AIAN stands for American Indian Alaska Native, so our indigenous communities, and you'll see that interpersonal violence, at least in these basic frequencies, no tests for significant differences here just yet, but experiencing quite a bit of high levels of different types of violence throughout their lifetimes. When we're thinking about institutional violence, so giving this a little bit more context, we're thinking about violence that happens within institutions. So verbal, physical, sexual types of assaults and violence by individuals in institutions or by actual institutions themselves, actors within these systems. And what we'll see is a different kind of narrative, but again, high risk factors here for our indigenous populations, but a lot more spread out in terms of risk. We see, for example, one pretty significantly high rates coming from the education system. I know we're all in perhaps different global contexts, but here in the US, the debate around what transgender rights really has anchored so much around education and whether transgender students will have fair and equal access to classrooms, to be addressed in the way that they want to have their names listed the way they want to, and even what bathrooms they can use in their own schools. And these cases have gone up as high as the Supreme Court in the US. And so we see that one aspect of institutional forms of violence affecting transgender people. And then that third category, structural violence, we're thinking the big picture, the social order, two big things that USTS focused on: economic marginalization, so things like employment insecurity, experiencing homelessness, living under the poverty line, and engagement in high risk, vulnerable work like the underground economy or engaging in sex work. And so what we see here with structural violence is, again, we see higher rates of economic marginalization. Again, what that tells us is we know through IPV research and lots of violence research that these are the correlates to creating vulnerability. And what we see is intersectionally heightened rates of some of those risk factors that might make transgender lives even more uniquely susceptible to violence. Similarly, with engagement in underground economy work, while all of us have free agency to engage in work and have our work respected, researchers and advocates, of course, worry about this representing more of survival work, and not necessarily full free choice, or a combination or a complex understanding of what it means to freely choose to do high risk work. And we know, once again, that that's tied into higher risk for violence, but that it's also correlated with the distinct structural vulnerability, high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, and high rates of homelessness. So to give this a little bit more context, even just in terms of situating IPV among all these different types of victimization, I want to pull in more of these recent findings from USTS. And one of the things that I was able to do with other researchers is see what the state of polyvictimization was among transgender people living in the US. And what polyvictimization means is experiencing multiple forms of violent victimization across the life course. And so what we see here are pretty high rates among transgender IPV survivors, about 35% in this large sample, experiencing multiple forms of violence, things like sexual assault, anti-transgender family violence, K-12 violence, or general anti-trans physical violence. What this tells us about trans IPV is that survivors are contending with, or likely contending with, multiple forms of victimization, complicating our understanding of IPV, complicating how we address and serve these survivors, and really complicating linear studies that really try to only focus on one form of IPV or one form of violence. And we see that this may be a bit more of a complicated picture. Particularly what we find, not completely, but generally, more marginalized segments of trans communities in these samples had greater likelihood of experiencing polyvictimization. What this might point to is that folks who are marginalized in lots of other different kinds of ways beyond their gender identity are perhaps more likely to experience a greater number of victimizations beyond IPV. So all of these kind of intersections of violence, we're here to talk about IPV, but it's just super important to place trans lives within this hostile cultural context that we live in the US and around the world, because this is what paints risk for IPV. It complicates how we understand IPV, and it gets us to focus on a variety of factors beyond sort of the limited scope of IPV. In Transgressed, one of the people that I got to talk to, one of the transgender survivors I spoke with, Laura, a 33-year-old Black trans woman at the time, as we were talking about these various forms of her experiences, her story, her narrative, getting familiar with one another. She was one of my first participants to say, you know, what do you mean by IPV? Because I have all of these other lived experiences and accounts of violence, and they've painted or structured the way I view my opportunities and view my choices as they feel limited and constrained. And one of the things that stood out to me as she was telling me about her abusive experiences is that she, quote here, "I wanted this to work," meaning her abusive relationship, because who's going to want me now? What's my luck of finding another person that wants to love a trans person? This struck me quite a bit, and it was something echoed throughout the participants, is this heightened vulnerability presented a lot of opportunity for abuse. It presented opportunities for abusers to manipulate, to control, and to make their victims feel like they were trapped and had no other choice. So Laura is part of Transgressed, the broader qualitative study on 18 transgender survivors, which at the time was really one of the first empirical attempts to look at patterns of abuse among those who were transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or otherwise gender non-conforming. So what we were seeing prior was that there wasn't a lot of research, or hardly any, that focus on transgender IPV, but we had lots for decades really, on gay and lesbian IPV. And usually because of sample size issues and methodology issues, researchers would simply say, well, I didn't have enough of the sample to say anything about it. So in comes Transgressed with a small sample, but important because we weren't even really looking at these samples before in a lot of detail, at least not in this context. And so it paved a little bit of ground in thinking about, even if it's a small sample, giving us a glimpse into what patterns could be salient, what themes could be salient in the experiences of IPV in trans lives. And one of the kind of theoretical arches here that thread through the way I tried to frame my understanding going into my conversations with the participants was I was interested in, of course, staying grounded in what they were saying. I was interested in this idea of queering power, which has been thoroughly written about, of course, and much debate about what queering actually means. But for me, in terms of this kind of work, I was really interested in queering power by really staying close to the power behind language, the accounts, and seeing power a little bit differently than we have been seeing in IPV research. What we were seeing a lot, and still see really, in at least in the US with this kind of research, is that it's very top-down, structural oriented, where some groups have all of the power and some groups have none of the power. I wanted to complicate that so that we could understand power as not just simply embedded in preordained structures or social categories, but rather that power is also situational. When we're thinking of, for example, these accounts of abuse, we're thinking very micro, very situational. And so it wasn't always neatly, or the analyses that were structural were not always neatly capturing queer and trans experiences, because we fall out of the typical binaristic kind of way of thinking. So it wasn't just, let's add trans people and stir, but rather, let's queer the way we understand power, and yes, focus on or acknowledge structural power, but then also see how gender manifests situationally and how power manifests situationally through the use of language and discourse. One of the things that I think this does is that it gets us to, yes, focus on identities, but then also see that regardless of our identities, abusers can weaponize external hostilities against their victims in order to maintain power. For example, among the 18 people, there were 19 stories of abuse. And among those, 6 of the abusers were transgender themselves. I think this is sometimes surprising to a lot of readers who come in with this rigid power structural analysis, and they think the people who are abusing trans people are all cisgender. And what queering will do is get us to disrupt our assumptions about rigid structural power and instead see how even trans people, or other marginalized peoples can also weaponize external hostilities against their partners. So I want to walk us through broadly the three main themes in Transgressed. One, just this descriptive dynamics of abuse. This emerged as the main types of patterns that I was seeing in the story, the types of attacks. Mainly these were emotional, psychological, and controlling tactics, and they happen in tandem with sexual and physical violence. And so I named these genderist and transphobic attacks, and I'll give an example of what that looks like. Then I'll move into tactics of abuse. So this is when survivors were telling me what they thought the violence meant to them. What was the abuser trying to do according to the survivor perspective? And this is where I engage with identity work and what the abusers were trying to do through controlling gender transition, controlling identity, and ultimately trying to discredit their partner's identity work. And then lastly, I'll loop in help seeking. Everyone I spoke to left their abusive relationships, so we got to discuss how they did that. So as an example of a genderist or transphobic attack, I talked to Anna, who was a transgender woman, Latina, 30 years old at the time. And Anna came from a migrant background. We actually shared quite a bit of similarities in terms of our lived experiences living and relying on migrant community and family. And Anna experienced homelessness, employment insecurity, and was working at bar when she met her partner, who would later become an abusive partner. In Anna's accounts, she echoed what I heard a lot of participants say, which was that the escalation of abuse included a lot of gender regulation, genderist and transphobic attacks. So for example, Anna is saying here that her abuser would say, quote, "Leave whenever you want. See if anyone is going to give you what I did. You're lucky I'm even here for you. You know, men think you're gross and that you're just a man in a dress. No man is going to see you as a woman, and even if you get one, they just want to sleep with you. They don't want to love a circus act like you." And so Anna described how frequently and routinely her abuser would slip into this transphobic kind of attack in tandem with many of the physical and sexual aspects that she was experiencing. I differentiate transphobic attacks from genderist attacks because transphobic attacks like this one target transgender identity, while genderist attacks target and regulate gender performance, gender identity and expression, and police sort of these appropriate notions or normative notions of how gender is done. In terms of the meanings that came from the survivors themselves, when I asked them sort of what they thought motivated their abuser or what they thought what the violence meant to them, Audrey, who identified as a trans female, was white and 42 years old at the time, tells me here about her partner, quote, "Her attacks on my passability as a woman, it was an attempt to manipulate me, to take away something that I was feeling good about, and you know, how I was able to present myself as female and learning how to look beautiful and look pretty, and the way I dressed and the way I see myself and trying to turn that into a negative for me. It was taking away those things that I found self-fulfilling and trying to pull those away so that there would be a void there and that she could come in and fill it." Audrey there is discussing, again, what I saw as a pattern throughout the accounts, that beyond just the descriptive accounts of genderist and transphobic attacks, the survivors gave meaning to what was the goal, what did it mean? And Audrey is telling us here that this was an attempt, or these tactics were an attempt to erode her sense of self, to exploit her vulnerabilities, and to weaponize really external hostilities against transgender people, to entrap Audrey. As we see here, she's describing that she was turning things that were positive into something that was negative, with the center of it being her gender identity here. And so this had a way of making survivors feel like they had little to no choice, but to remain in an abusive relationship. I saw multiple different formats of discrediting identity work that went beyond sort of these um, negative psychological, verbal, and emotional put downs, and instead also targeted active identity construction, such as interventions, medical interventions, gender affirming treatments. I heard from participants that abusers would often target healthcare appointments, canceled appointments, show up at medical appointments, destroy gender affirming medications, and other objects used by really all of us, and not just transgender people, to present or affirm our own genders. Joe, oops, there we go. Joe was the youngest participant I spoke with. He was only 18 at the time, identified as a transgender male, was white and Latino. And Joe met his abuser in a school context. He was a little bit older, but not much older than he was. And Joe, in particular, experienced a lot of sexual violence from his abuser. And the sexual violence came in tandem with this attack on his identity. In particular, Joe here is telling me about a story about his what led to one of the sexual assaults that he experienced. Joe was already out as trans, just like everybody in this sample. They were out as trans before they started these relationships. But even still, abusers saw openings for identity erosion here. And Joe is telling me here, quote, he would say, I can handle you physically modifying the upper half of your body, but if you change the lower half of your body, it's wrong. That you have to keep what you have to use it, you have to get over it and make a baby with me. And so Joe's abuser regularly threatened to impregnate Joe. We see reproductive coercion. And Joe described it to me as a tactic to manipulate his gender dysphoria and to constantly erode his identity as a man by referring to this reproductive forced coercion, rapes, and sexual assaults. In particular, at the time, this was, of course, really concerning to hear. We see reproductive coercion as a problem in IPV, but if you are paying attention or have heard at all to what's happening here in the US politically, I'm more concerned than ever that we've lost our constitutional right to bodily autonomy, to choose what we want to do with our reproductive freedoms. I think this is going to be a potential issue, especially depending on where you live in the US moving forward, now that many locations are banning abortion, even in cases of rape itself. So as I mentioned earlier, I did get to speak to people who have left their abusive relationships. So I got to hear about how they navigated genderist resources, right? Here we're back to Anna from earlier, who was one of my only participants who went to shelters. So she says here, well, I knew that I couldn't go to a homeless shelter. The homeless shelters are mostly full of men, and I learned it wasn't safe for me there. Plus, years ago when I needed them, I looked too much like a woman. Then that the staff was saying I needed to go to a women's homeless shelter, that the men there may threaten me or something. But I remember the women's shelter didn't want me either. They said they only allow women there and they have children there, and then I would cause like a scene or something. I don't know, they were just weird about it. I think if I would have pressed, they would have let me in. But because they were so unwelcoming from the start, I just couldn't. But the woman I was living with, as a hint for me to get out, she actually said I could go to a women's domestic violence shelter. And at those shelters, you don't have to leave during the daytime, you can stay a couple of months. And so Anna echoed what a lot of participants perceived about the shelter system, but she was one of the few who actually attempted. This echoes what we are seeing more and more in the literature on help seeking for transgender IPV survivors, and that is that they are encountering hostility in the shelter system. Not only are they not feeling included in the services that are provided, but perhaps they might be experiencing some hostilities from both staff, but also from survivors in the shelter themselves or people utilizing the shelters themselves. And so it paints this picture of a pretty hostile formal help-seeking resource, which is the shelter system. Interestingly, to give it a little bit more recent research, this is not in Transgressed, but since we're on the topic of help seeking, I want to pull back in the USTS because researchers there asked IPV survivors, transgender IPV survivors, if they utilized a rape crisis center or a domestic violence shelter. And so one thing I was able to do with my colleagues was look at the trans community here, broadly speaking, in terms of a variety of identities and social characteristics, and see who was more or less likely to report that they went to a shelter or didn't go to a shelter. And then subsequently, researchers also asked whether or not survivors didn't go to a shelter because they feared a transphobic response. And we saw a lot of interesting findings here along different types of identities. And broadly, what we saw in terms of the odds of seeking help from survivor agencies was that trans men, for example, when compared to trans women, were more likely to go to a survivor agency. Those who were assigned female at birth and were genderqueer, our indigenous groups, Alaska Native or American Indian, those who were poorer, who were transphobia victims and victims of any IPV type, but especially controlling IPV. So it tells us a little bit about who's coming into shelters, and it gives us an idea of potential differences within the transgender community. We're not talking about a monolith community, we're talking about a diverse community in which we have many other factors beyond gender. Back to the odds of seeking help or not seeking help due to fearing a transphobic response. Since this was a question in USTS, we got to run a model to see, again, based on these characteristics, whether or not or who was less likely to seek help because they feared a transphobic response. And so we saw that those who avoided shelters because they feared a transphobic response were trans women, asexual or bisexual transgender people, poor, younger, undocumented, child-free, those who'd ever experienced homelessness, transphobia victims, and victims of any type, but particularly sexual. And so these were folks who said they didn't go to a shelter because they feared a transphobic response. And so we might see trans women in particular standing out as avoiding shelter agencies and fearing transgender or transphobic responses. Interestingly, in that first model, the one on odds of seeking help from survivor agencies, undocumented transgender people were omitted from the model because none of them reported seeking help. So what this tells us is, again, that generally, not always, but as we intersect more marginalized groups, we're seeing more barriers to help seeking in terms of formal help. So what did these survivors do? Since many of them could not rely on the police or experience victimization from police, from shelters and other formal systems, they relied on friends. And instead of relying on these formal systems. Here I'm introducing Fatima, who's a trans woman, Latina, 30 years old at the time, and she's telling me about how she got out and who was most helpful to her. And so she's saying here, I had to do everything like in secret. I didn't have connections to family anymore or that community at all. I knew that was the only way to call a friend. The bad thing was that I was like, well, oh, damn, I haven't talked to this person in so long. My depression put me away, like, from anyone. I try to explain everything, and she, the friend, told me to call the police if I needed to, and that she's going to tell her husband that I need to stay in the living room at least for a couple of weeks. If it wasn't for her, I don't know what I would have done. And so Fatima echoes here what I heard from most of these survivors was that they were able to leave because of community help, not because of formal help seeking, but because of friends, colleagues, other family members that they weren't isolated from. And what that told me is that we all have some kind of role to play in terms of being able to recognize abuse, but then also being able to connect, or feeling empowered enough to connect our community members, to help and being there for one another when formal structures fall short, like the criminal legal system or shelter services. So what is the future of TIPV for now, right before we go into Q&A? It's looking like a lot of different things. Earlier, Lily mentioned the volume, which is also by NYU Press, in which me and Anna Messenger put together a group of transgender IPV scholars and advocates to give a comprehensive introduction to what the field looks like right now. And so we're very much kind of in this, no longer in this elementary state of the research, and it's quite advancing. There's a lot more research and best practices out there than we have seen recently. A lot of folks, including myself, are interested in improving measures and, of course, expanding and improving our theories, especially for me, theories around victimization. I think the US Transgender Survey is probably one of the main sources of large data for transgender people living in the US. And this organization, these researchers, they are currently right now collecting data for USTS 2022. It was supposed to start in 2020, but of course we had a global pandemic and that stopped. So now they're starting it back up this year. And that data is going to be pretty important. So I'm going to be looking out for that. And I think another kind of takeaway or forward thinking about TIPV, if this is beyond theory and the academic stuff, but what are we going to do about these issues? I'm more and more focused on alternatives to the criminal legal system. And I think this is going to be a growing area in TIPV. Mainly because we see a lot of focus on improving the police state, improving criminal legal responses. And even still, we still see a lot of harm. And so if survivors are not turning to these systems, what else can we do to intervene safely, promote safety, but also promote accountability? In ways that don't rely on racist, punitive, historically problematic criminal legal systems in the US. I'm plugging here Mimi Kim, her creative interventions work. You can, of course, search for this if you're interested. It's public information. It's not behind a paywall or a journal. Creative intervention folks talk about how it would look like to hold people, abusers accountable, involve community and anti-violence responses in ways that are different than what we have been doing. And then, of course, there's lots of ideas around best practices for trans-inclusive shelters, how we market and frame those services, how we train our staff, how we involve folks who are using the shelter services as well, and creating safe and welcoming and affirming environments for everybody, not just transgender people, of course. So that is it, and I think we're kind of right on time, or making good time. And so there's, of course, much more to say. I'm plugging the volume here, especially if you're interested in best practices. We've put together folks in the legal field, in policing, and shelter services, healthcare, medical professionals. There's sort of a lot there if you're interested in the direct kind of service work elements. I think that would be a great resource there. But that's it for me, and I think we can turn over to Q&A.